The Simpsons.
In season 6 of The Simpsons, the episode The PTA Disbands has a discussion between the teacher Edna Krabappel, Bart's teacher, and Principal Seymour Skinner. It's about the lack of funding and the issues that Springfield Elementary is going through. Edna, to Principal Skinner, goes, and look at the literary materials that our students are forced to read. It's all the banned books from other schools. So they get the rejection books, and that's all they can afford. So today's video is the list of the books that Springfield Elementary has to read. Tek War was published in 1989 and was created by William Shatner, yes, that Shatner, and was ghostwritten by the author Ron Goulart, who was known to do some scripts for Marvel's comics and also did some of the 1970s books on Flash Gordon. The books itself are a series of 9 books, and it's based on 200 years in the future, the concept of this illegal microchip mind drug, which kind of puts you in this like Matrix-like, paradise for the user, and how this former cop had been imprisoned and put into this stasis of prison for 4 years, released on early good behavior, and of course his now being a PI and investigation into where these drugs were coming from. The series did get popularity and became a comic book series, and then eventually a TV series, which was filmed in Toronto. It ran for 2 seasons and, well, got some trading cards out of it. The TV series was only about 50 years in the future, and Shatner was in it, but not the main character. The Theory of Evolution, also known as The Origin of Species, was published in 1859 by Charles Darwin. By the 1870s, this theory was widely accepted by the scientific community, but the theory known as the Charles Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution was co-written originally with a naturalist known as Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace himself has been forgotten in history, started as a map surveyor with his brother, really started to like collecting beetles and whales. He was convinced to then go to Brazil, which back then was like going to Mars basically, because it was, a little difficult and untraveled. And he started surveying and doing his own maps while on a trip to Brazil. He collected many species and wrote many notes, and blew up part of his hand with a gun accidentally on that trip. But tragically, his ship burnt on his return to England, and he lost all of that scientific research and species that he was bringing back. Shortly afterwards, he did go to Indonesia, where he started studying and collecting species there, and he brought to the world thousands of undiscovered species, and his notes and his documents and his map-taking are just astonishingly beautiful. He came across 2 islands in Indonesia where on one side you had lions and elephants, and the other you had marsupials. So you had like platypus, like duck-billed platypus, which he, seeing that these islands were like 25 miles apart, started to come up with his theory that there was a biographical evolution. So basically he's the forefront father of the concept of evolutionary geography, biogeography. So while in his collections and in his many bouts of malaria, as he kept getting malaria when he was in his travels, he wrote a series of essays and then mailed them to Charles Darwin. Darwin, panicking, realizing that this naturalist, not a trained scientist, came up with the exact same idea, and then had this theory that he must have read titles of, and then summarized through that this concept of evolution, which I'm about to bring to the world. But fortunately, he did actually give some credit to Wallace, to the scientific community, where you got the joint theory of evolution. But by the time he was publishing his book, his publishers made sure that Wallace's name was not mentioned anywhere in the books. But Wallace, being such a good, great guy, and the letters that are between the two men, Alfred says, like, oh, what a great book. I could never have written anything like that. And Darwin's just like, well, I think you could have easily, and I'm sorry. And Wallace is like, don't worry about it. It's a great book. Gentlemen. The book Sexus, published in 1949 in France, written by Henry Miller, about a man, it was a self-fiction, about how he had a first marriage, got divorced, had a second marriage, but still fancied his first wife, and then the subsequent affairs that he was having. And the book has a lot of sex scenes, although it's meant to be like some philosophical realism approach towards marriage, love, and self. But the book was so raunchy that it quickly got banned in France, and the publisher was fined and then imprisoned. The next book that the Simpsons have is 40 Years of Playboy. And I'm not going to talk about that, because that guy is a creep. Steal This Book is a 1971 published by Abby Hoffman, and it's the concept of counterculture. So it's looking back at the 60s anti-government movements, and Hoffman himself came up with the term pig empire, which was widely used at the Woodstock Music Festival. The book comes in 3 sections, so survive. So it's basically like how to get free things like furniture, art, food, legally and illegally, and of course like techniques on how to shoplift and things like that. Fight is about underground movements, so like guerrilla guerrilla radio and TV stations, growing weed, living in communes, and even making homemade bombs. And how to get a free bison from the Department of the Interior, because that was a thing apparently. The last section is about liberate, so it's basically like the local solutions in cities and other books that you could steal, which would help you kind of do this anti-government movement. While no publisher wanted to publish this story, so he had to actually create his own publishing company, known as the Pirates Publishing, and through popularity, it actually made bestsellers lists. To him, he found very ironic because that was not his intention. The co-authors of this book, he actually lists them as co-conspirators and accessories to the fact, which is kind of funny. The next book, Hop on Pop, published in 1963 by Dr. Seuss, is a very young children's book. So it's the most Seuss for the youngest of the youth book, but was never really banned until recently, actually in 2013, and a library in Toronto proposed banning it due to the violent nature towards fathers by hopping on them. Okay, didn't get banned. And the final book was published in 1988 by Salman Rushdie, The Satanic Verses. And the Simpsons have the junior illustrated version. It's a story about magical realism. So it's about 2 Indian Muslim actors in England who are expatriates. The story itself, eventually they do return to India, and one of them commits murder and then suicide. It was Salman Rushdie's 4th book, and it was widely praised and popular. But then on February 14th of 1989, Ayatollah Khamenei issued a fatwa against anyone who helped publish this book and to Salman himself, and so had many attempts of murder on the writer. Eventually, one of the book translators was murdered in his university offices. So he was an associate professor at the University of Tsukuba, and his name was Hitashi Igarashi. And he was stabbed multiple times to his face and to his arms. The killer was never apprehended. And Salman Rushdie is still alive, thankfully. So, those are the banned books that Simpsons and Springfield Elementary have to read. Principal Seymour Skinner has a little moment. He's just like, well, one of these days the kids have to learn about Tek Wars. Right, Nelky? Yeah, what a good boy you are. So, to The Simpsons and illuminating such interesting literature. Some are, well, I can see why they're banned. Others, okay. So if you want to take a look at some other playlists, follow the list below. Also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Or if you want to hear some Star Wars content, you can take a listen to the podcast I co-host on, which is Legends Library. We talk about the expanded universe books, so it's pre-Disney, thankfully. And that's on the Coffee with Kenobi network. So, to Springfield Elementary and to banned books. See ya!